Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing the Detroit Red Wings and Tampa Bay Lightning. How are they fare in the offseason, and how are they looking heading into next season? We'll get to all of that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey Channel. Now, like we did in my last video, we're going to be discussing a couple of teams' off-season reviews and season previews. Now, these teams that we're going to be talking about today, one made the playoffs, was exited in the first round, one missed the playoffs quite substantially. So we'll get to both these teams right now, and we'll start with the Detroit Red Wings. So for the Red Wings, they went into this offseason after having missed the playoffs. Again, the Red Wings were sellers at the deadline. They moved guys like Tyler Bertuzzi, Oscar Sundqvist, and Philip Hronek at the deadline. They sold off a couple of key pieces. They definitely took a nosedive after that. They wound up finishing with a 35-37-10 record, 7th in the Atlantic, 12th in the Eastern Conference, finished 12 points back of Florida for the last playoff spot. So definitely, it wasn't a fantastic season for the Red Wings again. Once again, finished with a top 10 draft selection. So it was not a fantastic season for Detroit, and I think they're looking for some improvements this year. Now, they're in a really tough Atlantic division. They definitely needed to do some things this offseason that really improved this team and made them a little bit more competitive for next year. So here's what they did. Here are the additions and losses they did in the offseason. So basically, they lost Pierre Suter to Vancouver. They lost Am Erne and Alex Chiasson, both who are currently UFAs right now. They lost Weatherby, who was an in-season acquisition, to Nashville. They lost Philip Zadina, who was a 2018 sixth-round pick, a guy who they mutually decided to terminate a contract with. Lost him to San Jose. They moved Dominic Kubalik to Ottawa in a trade. They lost Robert Haig as a free agent to Anaheim. They lost Mark Pysyk as a free agent. He's still a free agent. They lost Gustav Lindstrom in a trade to Montreal. And then they lost Alex Nedeljkovic and goalie Magnus Hellberg, both to Pittsburgh in free agency. So they did lose some pretty good pieces. They lost their backup and third-string goaltender. They lost a couple of depth defensemen. They lost a couple of depth forwards, as well as a couple of middle six guys in Suter and Zadina. So obviously, it was not a fantastic offseason for their losses, but they definitely replaced them with some key players. On the forward group, they got Christian Fischer, JT Compher, traded for Alex DeBrincat, got Daniel Sprong, and got Klim Kostin. Those are some fantastic additions. Kostin and Sprong were fantastic bottom six forwards for Edmonton and Seattle respectively this year, and should be fantastic additions in the bottom six. They added JT Compher, who should be a fantastic middle six addition, sort of like Kopp last year. Should be a decent middle six forward, maybe a little bit overpaid in my opinion, but still a decent middle six forward coming off a career season. They also have Christian Fischer, who I think should definitely challenge for like a fourth line role, maybe be a spare for the Red Wings. And then they got the big prize in Alex DeBrincat, who probably paired alongside Larkin and Raymond, should be a fantastic top-line addition for the Red Wings. On the defensive end, they replaced losing Haig, Pysyk, and Lindstrom by adding Shane Gostisbehere, Justin Holl, and trading for Jeff Petrie. Gostisbehere, one-year deal, not too expensive. He is a fantastic offensive powerhouse. He showed that in Arizona these past couple of years. He can work on the power play one. He can definitely put up points. So I think adding Gostisbehere, especially in a short-term deal, is a fantastic addition for the Red Wings. They get Justin Holl. I'm not too sure about the contract, but he should be able to be a decent third-pair defenseman, maybe a healthy scratch at some points. So definitely think Holl's going to be a decent addition there for Detroit. Jeff Petrie, older guy, but he can still put up points. He was coming off a 30-point season last year with Pittsburgh, was traded from Pittsburgh to Montreal, flipped by Montreal to Detroit. Definitely, he's going to be a solid addition, either on the second or third pair for the Red Wings. So that's another really good addition for Detroit. And then they replaced the two goalies they lost with James Reimer and Alex Lyon. Lyon showed last year he can be a fantastic third-string goalie. So if there's injuries, I would expect Lyon to definitely be called up. For Reimer, his numbers were a bit down, but he was playing on a low-end San Jose Sharks team. So being the backup 1B goalie to a guy like Ville Husso, I think should be a fantastic improvement for him, and he should definitely continue to do really well. So in my opinion, Reimer should be a fantastic backup goalie for the Red Wings. Lyon, a fantastic third stringer. You have Petrie, who should challenge for a second or third pair spots. Gostisbehere should be a top four defenseman. Holshoe should be a sixth, seventh defenseman on that team. Kostin, Sprong, Fischer are all good bottom six forwards. Compher's a good middle six forward, and DeBrincat's a really good top six forward. So in my opinion, Detroit really did a good job here by adding all of these players. In my opinion, they had a really productive offseason. If you look at the losses, look at the additions horrendously outnumbered the losses in terms of quality and the quality of players they got. So in my opinion, those were some fantastic additions, and it's been a really good season from Steve Yzerman. The one thing I do wonder is if they're starting to box out some of those players, because on the defensive end, I wonder if they're able to even call up a guy like Simone Edvinsson, who I think has earned himself a spot on the NHL roster. On the forward group, I don't see Marco Kasper getting a shot this year. Once again, another guy who I think has earned himself an NHL spot. So, in my opinion, I could see him start to box out some players. But all in all, I think they did really good this offseason by bringing in those players. They also had a ton of draft currency this year, used a lot of it on their own players. Their top 3 picks in the 2023 draft was the 9th overall pick, using it to select center Nate Danielson, the 17th overall pick in the first round, using it to select right shot defenseman Axel Sandin-Pellikka. Danielson's projected to be a good middle 6 center. Pellikka, a good top 4 puck moving defenseman. Then in the second round, with their own pick, number 9 overall, they selected Trey Augustine, who seems to be a possible goalie of the future for the Red Wings, and could, along with Kosa, be their future tandem. I think a tandem of Trey Augustine and Sebastian Kosa in the not-too-distant future will be a fantastic duo in Detroit. So in my opinion, those are some pretty good draft picks that they made for the first 3 picks of the 2023 draft. And there was definitely some other ones later in the draft that were really good for them too. So Detroit definitely did some really good things in their draft, had a lot of draft currency, did some really good things in their trade market, adding DeBrincat and Petrie, got a lot of good free agents, including some of the bigger ones like Compher and Gostisbehere. So all in all, they had a fantastic offseason. My current projected lineup for this Detroit team, as it sits right now, as you can see here, I have DeBrincat playing with Larkin and Raymond. I have Fabry playing with Comp and Compher, so a pretty decent top 6 in my opinion. On the third line, I have John Berggren playing with Rasmussen and Perron, so that's a pretty decent third pair. And then I also have Klim Kostin playing with Joe Veleno, who is at this point unsigned and needs to be signed before the season starts, and Daniel Sprong as the fourth line. So in my opinion, that's a fantastic top 4. The defensive end, I have Jake Wallman playing with Moritz Seider. That pair actually did quite well last year, and one of the reasons why the Red Wings signed Wallman to a 3-year extension. I have Gostisbehere playing with Petrie. I think that should be a really good second pair. I then have Mata playing with Ben Sherratt. That should be a fantastic third pair addition. I have Husso being the starter or 1A. It depends on how confident the Red Wings are in having him be the starter. I have Reimer be the backup or 1B. I could see Reimer get a pretty decent amount of games in next year. I have the spares being Elmer Soderblom, Christian Fischer, and Justin Hall. And at this point in time, with that current 23-man roster, they would have $5.89 million in cap space. So they would still need to sign Veleno. I don't think that would take too much cap space. And then they would still have just probably around $4 million in cap space, depending on how much Veleno comes to. So, in my opinion, that's a fantastic additions for the Detroit Red Wings. I think they should be a fantastic team next year. I wouldn't expect overly improvement. Like I said, I could see anyone between 7-2 in the Atlantic Division finish anywhere. But in my early predictions, I don't have the Red Wings being overly great. Once again, I think that defense is a little bit older than I'd like. Reimer, well, definitely an improvement on Nedeljkovic, in my opinion. I'm still not sure how well that goaltending duo will work. And while I do think they add some really good depth in the forward group, I'm still not exactly sure if they can compete with some of the more elite level teams in the Atlantic Division. So in my opinion, early 2023-2024 predictions, in my opinion, I have the Red Wings finishing with a record of 38-35-9 for 85 points, which isn't too bad. They would finish 7th in the Atlantic, though, in my current predictions, though, and 12th in the Eastern Conference, which is basically identical to what they did last year. But they would finish with 5 more points than they did last year. So in my opinion, I have Detroit being a little bit better, I have the Mill being a little bit more competitive, I have them still finishing really close to a playoff spot, but in my opinion, I still have them finishing one of the lower teams in the Atlantic Division. So I still think Detroit's done well, I think they still made improvements, but just like last year, I think teams like Ottawa and Buffalo are poised for more improvement this year. And I still think teams like Tampa and Florida and even Boston are going to compete this year. So I still have Detroit finishing as one of the lower teams in the East, but I still think they're having some improvement this year. Going over to the Tampa Bay Lightning, they made the playoffs last year, 3rd in the Atlantic Division, finishing with a record of 46-30-6 for 98 points, 3rd in the Atlantic, 6th in the Eastern Conference. They went to the Maple Leafs in round 1. They beat the Leafs in game 1. They would lose the next 3. They would force a game 6 with the game 5 win to cut the series lead to 3-2. And then they would lose in game 6. So first time in a very long time the Bolts have had a early season exit, given the fact that before this they went to 3 straight Stanley Cups. This offseason was all about them trying to keep as much of the band as they can together. Over the past couple of years, it started to become a lot more important for them to keep some of those players. Like last offseason, they lost Palat, they lost McDonough. They didn't have as much depth as they did in previous years, and they lost in round 1. So, once again, it was not a fantastic offseason for them. If you look at what they lost here and their additions, there's not too much, and the losses do outweigh the additions. If you look at their losses, they lost Alex Killorn to Anaheim. They lost Ross Colton in a trade to Colorado. They could not afford to keep those 2 guys who are key mainstays in the top 9. They lost Rudolph Balcers, who was UFA. They lost their entire 4th line. Corey Perry was traded and signed in Chicago. Patrick Maroon was dealt to Minnesota, and Pierre-Edouard Bellemare was signed with the Seattle Kraken. So they lost their entire 4th line and 2 key top 9 forwards. They also lose Ian Cole, who was a solid 3rd pair defenseman to Vancouver. They lose Brian Elliott, who was their backup goalie last year. He's still a free agent. But if you look at that team, that's a really, really bad loss for them. They lose 2 top 6 forwards, one who was a mainstay in their top 6 in Killorn, one who was a really good middle 6 in Colton. They lose their entire 4th line in Bellemare, Perry, and Maroon. They lose a solid 3rd pair defenseman in Cole, and they lose their backup goalie in Brian Elliott. Their additions, they're pretty good, but they're not anywhere close to the players they lost. They add Connor Sherry, who had a pretty good season last year in Washington. They add Logan Brown, who's definitely a good 4th line forward maybe, from the St. Louis Blues. They added Josh Archibald from the Penguins, who's a fantastic 4th line forward. Glendenning's a solid 4th line forward as well, adding him from Dallas. So that's their 4 additions. They added Sherry to replace in their top 9, and they had 3 guys who could definitely replace guys like Perry, Bellemare, and Maroon on the 4th line. So that's it. They don't have too much cap space to work with. Defensively, they lose Ian Cole. They replace him with Calvin DeHaan. That's not too bad of a swap. DeHaan's, I think, a little bit lower end than Cole, but they're pretty similar. They're both older defensemen who can play really good 3rd pair minutes. So in my opinion, that's a really good addition there for the Bolts. Their goaltending situation now looks a little bit bleak. They went out to acquire Jonas Johansson, who was the 3rd string goalie last year for Colorado. Not a fantastic backup. He showed over the past couple of years he's a decent 3rd stringer. He can come up if need be, but he's not a solid backup. And at this point in time, the Bolts have him as their backup. So it'll be really interesting to see what the Bolts do. Like I said, their backup goaltending position, not fantastic. Vasilevsky already was looking quite tired last year and did not look like playoff Vasilevsky in that first round series against the Maple Leafs. And now he doesn't have a solid backup goalie. With Elliott now gone and having Johansson as their backup, that makes it a little bit more difficult and puts a little more pressure on Vasilevsky. Defensively, I don't think it's too much of a significant change. They still have most of their D-core in place as they did last year. DeHaan, Cole, not too much of a difference. A little bit of a downgrade, but not too much. But the forward group, losing Killorn, losing Colton, losing Perry, Maroon, and Bellemare all this offseason, and replacing them with Sherry, Brown, Glendening, and Archibald. They're not bad additions, but they're not the additions who are going to hugely replace those guys. So in my opinion, Tampa didn't have a fantastic offseason. They lost a lot of pieces. I know that cap space is something that's hard to come by for a team like Tampa, but still, I think they have some really good additions, but nowhere near the additions that could replace guys in that forward group. They didn't have too much draft capital. They traded Colton for a second-round pick. With number 5 pick in the second round, they took Ethan Gauthier, who I think should definitely be a solid middle 6'4" down the road. In the 4th round, with their pick, number 9 overall, they selected right winger Shalgabe. And then with their 6th round pick, their own pick, number 19 overall, they selected right shot defenseman Clark. So, in my opinion, they did some decent things in the draft. They did not have basically any draft capital until the second day of the draft when they started to acquire a couple of picks. But still, they did not have too much draft capital. Like usual, they did well with the players they drafted, but they didn't have too much draft capital. My current projected lineup for this team, as you can see over here, is Braden Hagel on the top line with Braden Point and Nikita Kucherov. The second line is Stamkos and Cirelli playing with Connor Sherry. The third line is Alex Barré-Boulet, who I think will get a much-needed roster boost this year, playing with Nick Paul and Tanner Jeannot. On the fourth line, I have Michael Eyssimont playing with Luke Glendening and Josh Archibald. On the defensive end, I have Hedman playing with Chernak. I have Sergachev playing with Nick Perbix. And I have Dahan playing on the third pair with Darren Radish. I have Vasilevsky once again being a starter. At the current point, like I said, I have Johansson being the backup. And then I have Fleury and Bogosian as the spares. So at this point in time, that will give them about $700,000 in cap space. So it would not give them an overly great amount of cap space to work with, but they should be able to produce a 22-man roster, still being cap compliant. So in my opinion, not a fantastic offseason in my opinion for the Bolts. Now, for my current projection for the Bolts for this upcoming 23-24 season, with the amount of losses I have, I could definitely see them missing the playoffs. Like I said, I could definitely see that, but I'm not one to bet against the Bolts. They have the top-end players still. Unless they run into a whole bunch of injuries, they should still be a playoff team in my opinion. So I have them finishing with 43, 32, and 7 record for 93 points. I have them finishing 4th in the Atlantic Division. I have them finishing as the second wild card in the East. So I still have them making the playoffs. I don't have them being a top 3 team anymore, but I'm not going to bet against the Bolts. I think that Tampa is still a really good team at this point in time, and I still have them making the playoffs. I think they did pretty well given their cap situation, but they couldn't afford Killorn, they couldn't afford Colton. Those two alone made $10 million. They were not going to replace those guys. They lose their 4th line, which is a pretty good 4th line, and a 4th line that helped them make the Stanley Cup Finals over those past couple of years. So losing all 3 of those guys is not great. The defense is not really too much changed. The backup goaltending position is not good. In my opinion, that's just not fantastic news. So all those changes and giving them a D for this offseason, their drafting was okay, but just without the cap space they needed, this team got worse this offseason. So definitely, I don't think that they did really well. I'm giving them a D. But definitely, let me know what you think down in the comments about Detroit and Tampa. Does Detroit really warrant a B rating in the offseason? Does the Tampa Bay Lightning warrant a D? I think Detroit improved a lot. I think they'll do a little bit better next year, but being in a very competitive Atlantic Division, I still have them missing the playoffs. I'm sorry, Detroit Red Wings fans, but I think it'll start becoming a lot closer. I think maybe next year they'll be able to start challenging really, really hard for a playoff spot. For the Bolts, I do see them falling off a bit. I have them finishing 5 points lower than they did in the past year. I have them still making the playoffs. So I am not one who's going to bet against the Bolts to make the playoffs next year. So, in my opinion, I still have the Bolts making the playoffs, even though they had a really not too good of an offseason. And I still have the Red Wings missing the playoffs, even though they had, in my opinion, a pretty good offseason. So, definitely, love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. The Red Wings have a good offseason. The Bolts have a bad offseason. Definitely, do you think the Bolts are still a playoff team? Do you think the Red Wings are still not a playoff team? Do you think that my projected lineups and projected point totals are accurate, or is there something else you would change? Definitely, love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. But that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video, and if you really liked it, remember to subscribe down below. I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so definitely check that out. I have a link down in the description below, and I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.